Um, Hazel, are you there? Hazel?
Oh,
Hazel?
you can. You can use the chat function.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. A bright morning. Let's, first of all, are there matters arising from last time? Anything you didn't understand or want to discuss? Please intervene. Okay. Let's continue then with the narrative. We're moving right along and it's going not badly. So we were at the reign of the greatest of the sultans, Solomon the Magnificent, and we saw that, first of all, he carried Ottoman power right to the gates of Vienna, right to Central Europe in 1529, and nearly succeeded in taking the city. Charles V had to scurry from Spain to try and prevent this conquest. He did succeed in preventing the Ottomans from taking the city because the Ottomans were overextended. They were so far from their base, but it was a near thing. And to boot, a lot of the Lutherans refused to participate. The Lutheran Reformation was having its effects. And then we spoke about the fact that Charles V's problems were complicated by the fact that his arch rival in Europe, Francis I, the year before had made this treaty with the Ottomans, which was a real scandal because, my God, here's this Christian prince, the King of France, making a deal with the infidel and opening up the port of Marseille to the warships of the Ottoman Navy. And I noted that this was the beginning of the relationship between France and the Ottoman Empire, which became very deep, and the French established themselves, particularly in Lebanon and Syria, and ultimately turned those two places into colonies. Then I mentioned the fact that the Venetians, who had been the great Mediterranean traders during the Middle Ages and on into the early 16th century, they had their ongoing problems with the Ottomans. There were recurrent wars. There were rivalries between the Venetians on the one hand and the Jews and Greeks, Jewish and Greek merchants who came from Constantinople or from Greece. And there were these rivalries between the Venetians and the Greeks and the Jews. But I explained that ultimately they were forced into a kind of collaboration because faced with the intrusion of the Portuguese into India, it was in the interest of both the Ottomans and the Venetians to maintain this route through the Mediterranean and the Middle East. are there any questions about what I've said so far? Okay, well, in any case, there was both cooperation between Venice and the Ottomans and rivalry. And there was both war and peace. And the Ottomans were constantly sort of fighting the Spaniards, the Italian powers in the Mediterranean, because the ambition of under Solomon the Magnificent certainly was to not only become the dominant land power, but also to develop the Ottoman Navy to the point where the Ottomans would dominate the Mediterranean Sea. And so there did ensue a huge battle in 1572, off the coast, the western coast of Greece. There was an enormous battle of between 200 and 300 galley ships on each side. All of the Christian powers, the Spaniards, the Venetians, even the papacy, sent galley ships to fight the Ottomans. And one of the great battles of early modern history, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the Christians won a victory. They blocked the Ottomans from gaining complete control over the Mediterranean Sea. But it's significant to sort of discuss this because a few years later, and I'll show this, some 16 years later, in the English Channel, there was another great battle. These are the two great naval battles of the 16th century. The Spanish fought the English in the English Channel. This is a continuation of Spanish imperialism. And I'm looking for the illustration. This was an enormous battle. There were the Spaniards sent 130 galleons, men of war, into the English Channel. They were trying to invade England, and the English had about 100 ships themselves, and it was ultimately the English that triumphed. Now, why do I bring up juxtaposing the Battle of Lepanto to the Battle of the Spanish Armada in 1588? So it's 1572 in the case of Lepanto, and 1588 in the case of the Spanish Armada. Because if you recall the previous screen with these galley ships, there were many of them. But galleys have been used in warfare since Roman and Greek times. This is a continuation of the style of warfare and the sort of naval technology that stems all the way back to antiquity. And basically it depended on, there were some sails on these galleys, but it depended on rowers. Oars were used. Whereas what you see on the screen here are these uh, these galleons, ocean-going sailing vessels that were 3, 4, and 5 times as large as the galleys of the Mediterranean. And moreover, whereas the armament on the galleys of the in the Mediterranean, you could only carry a few cannon. Some of these ships had 60 and 70 cannon on them. And so what I'm really driving at is that the scale of naval warfare in the North Atlantic, Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, the scale of it is much larger than is true in the Mediterranean. And that reflects the difference between the Mediterranean economy and the North Atlantic economy. And what we see is that the North Atlantic economy is beginning to emerge, and it's on a much larger scale. And the forces of production that are involved, these large ships with a 60, 70 cannon, reflect the much stronger economies of Northern Europe as compared to the Mediterranean, including the Spanish and, of course, the Ottoman. And so we see as early as 1588 that the Northern Europeans, the accumulation of capital in Northern Europe is on a scale which is dwarfing the Mediterranean. And this, of course, ultimately turned into the fact that in the course of the 17th century, the Mediterranean fades. The Mediterranean becomes a backwater. And it is the North Atlantic economies that come to predominate. Do you have any questions or do you want to discuss this? Now, having said that, we should say that still in the 16th century, until about 1580, the Mediterranean, in terms of the trade with Asia, was still more important than the Portuguese trade around the coast of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. It was only after 1580 that the all-water route came to dominate, and the Mediterranean route began to seriously decline. And accordingly, this is the period, the 16th century, is the height of Ottoman power. They controlled the Middle East, they controlled the route to India, and consequently, the Ottoman Empire had a significant economic base. And if we therefore extract from that, we can see that as the Mediterranean declined, so too did the Ottoman Empire. And I'll have more to say about that in a little while. Now, what I want to do now is any questions? Okay. What I want to do now is to go into more detail about the sort of organization, a little bit about the history of the Ottoman Empire. But as I've explained, the Turks were the ruling class. They dominated the whole empire. They were the major beneficiaries. They occupied all the leading positions. They gathered most of the tribute and enjoyed, and let me tell you, the lifestyle of the Ottoman elite, the Turks, the Turkish rulers, was legendary. Great luxury and opulence. The Turkish carpets are still famous. And that was only one aspect of the sort of luxury furnishings of the homes of the landlord elite in the Ottoman Empire. So anyway, they were at the top. And the rest of the population, including the Arabs, the Christians, the Jews, the Armenians, and the rest, these were called the protected flocks, as in sheep, flocks of sheep. Well, these flocks of sheep, in order to live under the Ottomans, had to pay tribute, taxes, because of their religious inferiority, because most of them were infidels or ethnically inferior to the Ottomans. They were the protected flocks, and they paid. And the Ottomans, of course, they used the tribute and the taxes mainly for war and for luxury expenditures. Now, the striking feature of this whole setup was that I'm trying to, yes, the protected flocks, and I've mentioned them, the Jews and the Christians, and the Greek Orthodox Christians, the Armenian Christians, and what have you, they were permitted by the Ottomans to essentially, they paid their tribute to the Ottomans, but they were allowed to basically govern themselves. The Ottomans, of course, as you'll see, maintained an administration, but it was it was not a bureaucracy in the style of the French or of the Spaniards. No, the local communities, these religious communities, were referred to as millets, the millets. They were essentially for these millets. And these communities were allowed to govern themselves. They were self-governing communities under the Turks. The Turks had, of course, they had the military and they had their tax gatherers and so on. But local government was entirely in the hands of these so-called millets. So the Jews, for example, they were a self-governing community under their rabbis. The Greek Orthodox were another millet. They had a patriarch of Constantinople, and it was the patriarch who was the leader of the Greek community. And essentially, not only did he provide the religious services, the church, but also the governing administration was in the hands of the Greek Orthodox patriarch, and so on. Now, this is a huge contrast with what's going on in Western Europe, with places like France or England or Spain, where basically the reverse is true. In those countries, as we've seen, the political leader, even in Spain, basically the Spanish king basically controlled the church. The French king controlled the church. The English king controlled the church. Basically, it was a department of the state, we could say, in Europe. But in the Ottoman Empire, this was very different. And it implied a very different approach in terms of the sort of the destiny of the people that lived in Europe as compared to the destiny of the people who lived in the Ottoman Empire. Because in Europe, say we're talking about France as an example, we could say Spain or England or so on. Eventually, the king, through the bureaucracy, insisted that everybody had to turn into a Frenchman. Everybody had to turn into a Spaniard, and so on. There was an attempt on the part of the West European monarchies to basically homogenize the population. everybody had to become a subject of the king and essentially eventually identify as a Frenchman or a Spaniard or as an Englishman. In the Ottoman Empire, there were these self-governing millets. And so people were basically left to themselves. The Jews remained Jews, the Greek Orthodox, the Greeks remained Greek, the Armenians remained Armenians, so and so on. And in a certain way, the people who, the Jews, the Greeks, the Armenians, etc., they appreciated this. They didn't have to become all like the Ottomans. There was a kind of permissiveness. But if you're trying to build a powerful state, this is not a good way to proceed, is what I'm really getting at. Now, let's continue. The Ottomans then were the ruling elite, but they did, as I explained last time, particularly open themselves up to the Arabs. Once they had conquered the Arab lands, Syria, and Egypt, and so on, because they were the same religion, well, an Arab could become Turkified. If he accepted the Sultan as the ruler, he accepted the Ottoman way of life, the family could gradually, maybe they wouldn't be fully accepted, but they could, in a certain way, sort of assimilate and become influential families within the Ottoman Empire. So that's one thing we should know. But in the main, if you were pure blood Ottoman, if you were part of the original conquerors, you came from one of those families. These were the core of the ruling class. However, there was another institution, a strange institution. There was another way in which you could become part of the ruling class. And this brings me to an institution which was called Devzermeh, the Devzermeh institution. Some people call it tribute in blood, because as you know, as I've explained, from the 14th century onwards, the Ottomans had invaded the Balkans. Now the Balkans is made up a whole different groups of people. There are Romanians there are Macedonians, there are Bulgarians,
Professor,
yes.
could you please show how to type out Devzermeh on screen?
Yes, okay. Yes, just like this. Can you see? Can you see now?
Yes, thank you.
Devzermeh. Now this was, so there were all these, most of these people in the Balkans were Greek Orthodox. The Romanians, the Bulgarians, Macedonians, the Greeks, they were all Greek Orthodox. The only ones that were not were the Croatians, who were Catholic, and half of the Albanians became Muslim under Turkish control. But for the rest, they were Greek Orthodox. Well, as part of their tribute, if you could believe it, every year the Turks went around to the villages and they demanded that each village had to hand over a certain number of 7 or 8-year-old boys who would be removed from their families and taken to Constantinople to be trained as Turkish soldiers. They were enrolled in military schools and were trained to become part of to become the core of the Turkish infantry. More about that in a minute. But can you imagine 7 or 8-year-old kids taken out of the arms of their mothers and fathers and sent away to Constantinople because the Turks needed infantry. Infantry was the most important arm of warfare in early modern Europe. There was cavalry, and I'm referring to Western Europe as well. But with the invention of rifles at the end of the 15th century, as we saw, there were these standing armies, and the infantry was the most important. And so that was true also of the Ottoman army as well. They had very large numbers of infantry troops, regiments, and essentially these were the regiments were basically raised through the Devzirme system. And of course, the West Europeans commented on this. Of course, it was a tragedy for the families whose kids were essentially kidnapped. And of course, it would be, you could imagine the trauma. And it is undoubtedly brutal. But it occurred to me as I was preparing this lecture, hey, what about the residential schools in Canada? I'll leave it at that. But that is to say that the kids were taken away and to the residential schools in order to assimilate them to white culture. So I'm not saying it's the equivalent, but it is suggestive, the comparison. So,
Professor,
yes.
where were the Devzirme collected from? Where were the
From
children
the Balkans, you know where Greece is, north of Greece are the Balkans.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so so when I say so, the Ottoman elite consisted of the Turkish, the racially or ethnically Turkish aristocracy, but also some of the outstanding young men from the infantry did gain political influence. And these regiments of infantry, which were known as the, let me spell this out. These regiments were called infantry regiments of the Turkish army, Janissaries. Some of these people became politically influential. They got into the court of the Sultan, and they basically became part of the political elite. And more about that in just a minute. Now, the last element that formed the political elite, most of them are simply Turks. Then you have these kids who were born as Christians who were forcibly converted to Islam and became soldiers. Some of them rise up in the ranks. And the third element, and this is of course unusual for us, is that the Turks kept large numbers of domestic slaves. In the course of their conquests all over the Middle East, a lot of people were enslaved by the Turks. And some of these people would be brought to Constantinople. Some of them would be taken into the Sultan's palace. And believe it or not, some slaves, they had the status of slaves, but they were powerful politicians. They emerged because somehow they were clever and so on, or useful. They might become powerful politicians. And they were even some of these people were slaves, some of them were not, but there were a whole class of people who were essentially castrated males. The Turks would castrate them, they would become servants, and some of them would be in the service of the Sultan. And since they had very little else to do, they went into politics. And they became influential people as well. So there's a kind of bizarre quality to all of this. Well, to recapitulate, the ruling class, there are the Turks, then there are the Christian Janissary troops, and finally there are the slaves and eunuchs. There was a great deal of rivalry between these three groups. As things progressed in terms of the politics of the Ottoman Empire, you find that a lot of politics revolve around, on the one hand, the old original Turkish elite. Then there are the Devzirme Janissary element, especially the influential ones. Then there are the slaves and eunuchs, and they're all collected around the court of the Sultan, and they're fighting, they're jockeying for position. The politics of the Ottoman Empire, a lot of it unrolls as rivalries and even coups d'états between these different groups. The Sultan had to rule by basically trying to balance off the influence of these different groups within the political elite. Are there any questions about this? Now, of course, Istanbul was the capital, and there were a whole series of palaces that the Sultan inhabited. But the central institution of the palace was the harem, or the harem, which was basically the household of the Sultan, the household, and what a household it was, because it was filled with these slaves and eunuchs and servants, and especially hundreds of wives of the Sultan. The Sultan, because he was a ruler, and as ruler was thought naturally to be endowed with extraordinary sexual powers. Islam allowed polygamy. He could have as many as 1,000 wives. Of course, he had his favorites and so on, but there you go. And which brings me to basically make another point, and that is the condition of women, as I've already mentioned, under Islam and under the Turks was very bad. Women had to go about veiled, and they were regarded as the equivalent of slaves. So I would say that much. And I would say that overall, the situation for women in the West was slightly better. Not that much better. Because if you went to Spain or you went to Italy, other Mediterranean countries, the oppression of women in Spain or in Italy was also very bad. This is a particular characteristic of Mediterranean society. And things were somewhat better in places like Scandinavia and England. It seems to be the case that the further north you go in Europe, starting in the Middle Ages and continuing into modern times, the condition of women was somewhat better in Northern Europe than it was elsewhere. But of course, there was no equality anywhere. And that was the situation. Questions? Okay, that's the harem or the harem. But then, of course, there was the the rest of the administration, which I'm now talking about. And so you had a prime minister who was called the Grand Vizier, and then under him you had a council made up of viziers and pashas. That was basically the sort of core, the central sort of political institution of the empire. So there was the Sultan, who was both the religious and the political leader. Then you have the Grand Vizier, who is the prime minister. Then you have an imperial council made up of these viziers and pashas. And then there are basically 4 departments of state, or as they call them, institutions. There were 4 departments of state. There was a treasury and secretarial or secretary institution, which was called the scribal institution. This was the part of the bureaucracy that collected the taxes and sort of administered politically over the empire. Remembering that the millets were the local government, but from a central point of view, this was the so-called scribal institution was dominant. The second institution was the military institution. This is a regime that huge territories and believes in jihad, in religious military campaigning, and so the military is extremely important. And as I've explained already, the leading arm of the military is the Janissaries, who basically are recruited from the Balkan peasantry. The kids constitute the Janissaries. And as I explained, they ultimately they acquire political ambitions. They rival the old Turkish elite. Now, the old Turkish elite, they were the cavalry. The most distinguished arm, of course, is the cavalry. They were called the Sipahi cavalry. Then there is the Navy, commanded by a Grand Admiral. And the Navy, which certainly in the 16th, early 17th century, is largely made up of galleys, is essentially staffed by Greek sailors. I've already explained this. The Greeks are sailors. They're on the sea. They're merchants who travel the Mediterranean, and they're merchant mariners. And so the Navy is made up of these Greek sailors. And finally, there is an artillery corps, which originally was basically built up by Italian engineers. We saw under Mehmed II at the siege of Constantinople. And the artillery was the arsenal of the Ottoman army was huge, thousands of pieces of cannon. And in Constantinople, there was a huge foundry where in any given year, up to 1,000 pieces of cannon were basically manufactured in this armory. So I've mentioned the scribal institution. I've mentioned the military institution. The last important institution was the religious institution, which was basically headed by the Sultan, and under him there was this religious authority, the Sheikh al-Islam. He was basically the high priest of this Sunni Islam, and he had a council of religious advisors who were learned in the Quran. Many of them had a kind of legal, because Sunni Islam was a kind of all based on legal interpretations of the Quran. This was the setup, and I want to emphasize that there's a complete fusion of the state and religion. The Sultan is the head of the Islamic community, just as he is head of the Islamic political state. Are there any questions about this? I would note in this respect that there was always, since the Middle Ages in Western Europe, there's the Pope, and then there's the secular rulers. There's some separation, obviously not much, because in Spain or France, you had to conform, or England for that matter, you had to conform to the religion of the state, of course. But there was a kind of recognition that there's a difference between the temporal or secular realm and the religious. Religion dominates the Ottoman Empire. It dominates the populations, even if you're a Christian or Jew. Religion is the culture, we could say. Finally, I think I've mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating. Property rights were not as developed in the Ottoman Empire as they were in the West. In the West, certainly there was nothing like today. I mean, legally, people have an absolute right to their property. They can do whatever they want with their property. They can, within limits. You have the complete right to buy and sell, to speculate in your property and so on. But that was not true in the Ottoman Empire. In theory, everything belonged to the Sultan. Which is an important difference, because absolute property rights are fundamental to a capitalist market society. And so while markets existed in the Ottoman Empire, property rights were limited, and even markets were closely supervised by the government. So I guess what I'm pointing to is that well, certainly the development of capitalism in the West was a real struggle, step by step and so on, but in the Ottoman Empire, it would have been impossible. Now, I want to continue now. Does anybody have any questions about what I've said up to this point? We're going through and we're sort of describing the basic institutions of the Ottoman Empire here. The last thing that I want to describe are the millets, these institutions which dominated local government, which were the local government. I want to talk more about the millet system. There were basically 4 millets in the Ottoman Empire, these so-called autonomous religious communities. There was the Greek Orthodox millet. There was the Armenian millet. There was the Islamic millet. And there was the Jewish millet. Repeat, the Greek Orthodox millet, the Armenian millet. By the way, the Armenians, you know where Armenia is. It's in the Caucasus, just south of Russia. But many Armenians lived in Anatolia, what is now Turkey. So there was the Armenian millet, and the Armenians were famous as merchants, just like the Greeks and the Jews. So there were the Greek Orthodox, there were the Armenians, there were the There was the Islamic millet and there was the Jewish millet. I've already described the Muslim millet. It was led by the Sheikh al-Islam and was closely connected with the state, as we've seen. The Greek Orthodox millet the leader of it was the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople. The Archbishop of Constantinople was the leader of the Greek Orthodox community within the Ottoman Empire. And the Greek Orthodox, including the Greeks, but also most of the people of the Balkans, as well as Greece itself, and many Greeks also lived in Anatolia. They were all part of the Greek Orthodox millet. And of course, in the towns and in the villages, everybody lived in a Greek, who was Greek or was Greek Orthodox, lived within this sort of self-contained community. Likewise, the Armenian community, likewise the Jewish community, and likewise the Turkish or Arab community.
Professor,
Yes.
could you talk a little bit about what it means to be Greek Orthodox?
Yes. This stems back from the original separation between the East Roman and the West Roman Empire. You recall that in the ancient world, the end of the ancient world, the East Roman Empire tends to be Greek in population. The West Roman Empire, Italian or some other Gauls or Hibernians from Spain or Celts up in England and so on. So there's an ethnic difference. The Eastern Roman Empire was Greek speaking, and this continues right through the Middle Ages. Now, in the West, the Pope of Rome becomes the leader of the Western Church. In the East, they don't recognize the Pope, or they see that he's sort of a powerful bishop and so on, yes. But the Bishop of Constantinople, or say Alexandria, he just sees the Pope as, well, he's an important bishop, so are we. Well, over time, this difference becomes increasingly significant because the popes, they are increasingly claiming that they're the head of the Christian church, and the Greek-speaking people, including the heads of the Greek bishoprics, refuse to recognize the authority of the popes of Rome. And there are a series of religious controversies. The Pope takes one position, the Greek bishops take another, and eventually, around the 11th century, there's a complete split between these two forms of Christianity. And it's reinforced by the fact that the Greek Orthodox Church converts the Russians to their religion. The Greek Orthodox Church is basically the church that the Russians adopt. And so by the end of the Middle Ages, they're at loggerheads. Each side considers the other to be deviant or heretical. Do you understand?
Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. And this is, of course, important. I mentioned the Ukraine earlier. The western part of the Ukraine is Roman Catholic. The eastern part is Orthodox. There is a cultural division. I'm not saying it's determining the fighting that we're seeing or anything like that, but there are these cultural differences that are rooted earlier, and then there's a whole historical experience. So that's the way it was. So I've more or less described, there is the Armenian millet, there's the Greek Orthodox millet, there's the Islamic millet. Talk a little bit about the Jews. The Jews, they did not have a single head. The Armenian patriarch was the head of the Armenian millet. The Greek Orthodox, the bishop of Istanbul was the head of the Greek Orthodox millet. The Sheikh al-Islam was the head of the Islamic millet. But the Jews, they did not have a hierarchical structure. The synagogues were largely independent of one another in every town and so on. And so even though the sultans tried to set up some sort of headship, it didn't work. And so each of these Jewish communities was independent. The local rabbis, or sometimes there were in the court of Constantinople, there were wealthy Jewish bankers or physicians. The Jews were famous as doctors. And these people would have influence at the court, and they would influence what the Sultan policy toward the Jews would be. Now, over time, by the way, I would say that I mentioned that Mehmed II was the founder of the Ottoman state, and he did set up the bureaucracy. He did conquer Constantinople. But he also began these relationships with the different communities, the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Jews. And you can see the beginning of this millet system that I'm talking about. I think it's correct to credit Mehmed II with beginning the millet system. It perfected itself over many years, but it's worth mentioning this connection with Mehmed II. I'll pick up and possibly even finish in the next class dealing with the Ottoman Empire. So see you on Friday, and we'll move right along.